The village of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon was at its loveliest in winter, a place where the cold did not quite bite so much as nip politely. The cottages, with their thatched roofs and ivy frames, seemed to huddle together against the December frost, and the church tower rose like a watchful sentinel above them. It was the sort of village that would have been quite unremarkable to anyone passing through, except for those who knew, as Miss Marple did, that such places often hid their liveliest stories behind lace curtains and teacups. It was the evening of the annual Candlelight Service at St. Aldwyn's Parish Church, one of the village's oldest traditions. Villagers and visitors alike would gather in solemn beauty, the only light coming from hundreds of flickering candles held carefully in cupped hands. The choir would sing carols, the vicar would speak of peace and goodwill, and afterward everyone would share mulled wine and warm mince pies in the village hall. It was the sort of event that bound the community together, softly, gently, almost reverently. Miss Marple had come as a guest, staying with her distant cousin, Mrs. Caroline Weatherford, a warm-hearted widow who believed in cheerful hospitality and never allowed her guests to feel unimportant. The two women had spent the afternoon knitting by the fire, discussing nothing in particular, or so it would seem to anyone who did not understand the delicate art of conversation employed by elderly ladies who had seen much of the world. For them, the smallest detail, how someone said good morning, or whether they paused before answering a question, could hint at entire private dramas. "I suppose we must be off soon," Mrs. Weatherford said as she buttoned her coat, a deep plum-colored garment with a slightly frayed hem she stubbornly refused to replace. The choir always insists on starting precisely on the hour, and the vicar gets terribly flustered about lateness. Miss Marple nodded kindly. "Punctuality can be a refuge, Caroline. One holds on to what one can control." She spoke, as always, softly, never lecturing, yet always suggesting a thoughtful truth beneath her words. The church, as they approached, glowed warmly from within. Villagers were already gathering, some with hushed tones, others with cheerful greetings. Miss Marple observed them with her usual gentle attentiveness. It was not that she looked for anything in particular, rather she merely noticed. And people, being people, revealed much without intending to. Near the church entrance stood Mrs. Beatrice Hollowell, the churchwarden's wife, straight-backed and brisk, greeting everyone with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She had an air of someone who carried responsibility like a badge of honor, though perhaps, Miss Marple thought, also like a shield. "Good evening, Mrs. Weatherford. Miss Marple," Mrs. Hollowell said, inclining her head. "Do mind your candles later. We did have an unfortunate incident last year when Mrs. Pemberton set her hymnbook alight. It caused a dreadful stir." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently, "though I imagine Mrs. Pemberton has always been inclined toward excitement." Mrs. Hollowell blinked as though unsure whether Miss Marple was jesting. Then she nodded and returned to her duties. Inside, the pews filled steadily. The choir, clad in white robes with red collars, assembled near the chancel. Among them was a young woman of delicate frame and thoughtful eyes. Lydia Markham, Miss Marple recalled, newly arrived to the village to serve as the school's music instructor. She sang with clear, haunting tone, though there was something in her expression, a distance, perhaps, or a quiet grief carefully held. Miss Marple noticed how Lydia glanced toward the far aisle. Just once, and with effort to seem casual. Her gaze brushed a tall, dark-haired man standing near the rear of the church. He was lean, well-dressed, and had the air of someone accustomed to being noticed. Mr. Edward Langford, recently returned to the village after years abroad. His arrival had been the subject of village gossip for weeks. They did not speak, but the connection was unmistakable. "Ah," Miss Marple thought, "there is a story here." The vicar began the service. The first hymn rose softly, sweetly. Candle flames wavered gently, casting silhouettes on cold stone walls. Snow gathered on the windowsills outside, and the air was filled with pine, wax, and winter breath. It was during the third hymn, O come, Emmanuel, that something changed. A sound, sharp, abrupt, cut through the stillness. A gasp, then a muffled cry. Heads turned and the singing faltered. Miss Marple felt, rather than saw, a disturbance ripple through the congregation. A woman collapsed in the center pew, falling forward, her candle tipping dangerously. Someone caught her before she struck the floor. Voices rose in confusion. "Good heavens, Eleanor!" The name passed through the church like a wave. Mrs. Eleanor Godfrey, wealthy, fashionable, regarded as something of a refined outsider who nevertheless enjoyed being admired by the villagers. She was pale now, deathly so. Her eyes fluttered closed, and her lips moved without sound. Dr. Harris, who was always present at village gatherings, rushed forward, kneeling beside her. He checked her pulse. Once, twice, and then again, his expression shifting to something grim. "Extinguish the candles," he ordered sharply, "and clear the aisle." But it was already too late. Mrs. Eleanor Godfrey was dead. A silence settled, not peaceful, but heavy, suffocating. The choir stood frozen. Lydia's hand trembled so violently her candle nearly fell. Mr. Langford watched, jaw set, unreadable. Miss Marple did not gasp. She did not cry out. She merely observed. Small details, how Mrs. Beatrice Hollowell paled but did not seem surprised. How Mr. Langford's gaze flicked just once toward Lydia. How Lydia clutched her robe tightly, as though to steady herself from within. And how, in the light of many extinguishing flames, the church seemed suddenly darker than it had before. Mrs. Weatherford whispered, trembling, "Oh, Jane, how dreadful!" Miss Marple placed a gentle hand over hers. "Yes, Caroline," she murmured softly, "quite dreadful indeed." But her eyes remained thoughtful, clear, and quietly knowing. For she had seen such moments before. Moments when tragedy revealed not chaos, but intention. And in the flickering shadows of St. Aldwyn's Church, she felt the faintest stirrings of suspicion. Someone, she suspected, had planned this, and had planned it very well. By the time the church doors were closed and the candles extinguished, the village of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon was in a state of quiet hysteria. News of Mrs. Eleanor Godfrey's sudden death traveled faster than snowflakes in a winter gust. People spoke in hushed tones at the corners of streets, in the warmth of their homes, and over the counter of the village shop. The incident had shattered the gentle rhythm of the community, leaving it teetering between fear and curiosity. Miss Marple and Mrs. Weatherford returned to the latter's cozy sitting room, where a fire crackled and the tea was already steeped. Caroline's hands shook slightly as she poured, and Miss Marple observed her quietly, noting the faint tremor that betrayed more than mere fright. "It seems impossible, Jane," Mrs. Weatherford said, wringing her hands. "Eleanor, gone in a moment, and here of all places, the church. How could it happen?" Her voice, though soft, carried the tremor of a village in collective shock. Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "It is curious," she murmured. "The most ordinary places sometimes conceal the most extraordinary mischief, Caroline." Mrs. Weatherford raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She knew better than to press Miss Marple for explanations. The truth, when it came, always arrived in its own time. Outside, the streets began to fill with villagers, some seeking solace, others searching for gossip. Among them was Mrs. Beatrice Hollowell, who had excused herself early from the service, claiming she needed to prepare a report for the parish council. She now stood at her garden gate, speaking in a clipped voice to Mr. Harold Tebb, the baker's assistant. "It was quite shocking, Harold," she said, "and frankly, so predictable in a way." "Predictable?" Mr. Tebb stammered, flour dusting his hands. But, but she was so genteel. Mrs. Hollowell inclined her head, her expression impervious. People like that, Harold, always leave a trail of trouble. I've said it before, and I say it again. Nearby, Mr. Edward Langford had gathered a small group, including the vicar, Reverend Caldwell, and several ladies from the parish. He spoke in measured tones, careful not to reveal too much emotion. "It is, of course, a great shock," he said, eyes steady. "But we must remain calm. The authorities will investigate. Speculation is dangerous." Yet even as he spoke, his gaze flicked toward Lydia Markham, who had sought refuge in the corner of the room, her face pale and her hands tightly clasped. A momentary hesitation passed over her features before she forced a polite smile. Miss Marple, seated at the edge of a chair, noted every flicker, every tremor of expression. By mid-evening, the village hall, usually a place of warmth and community, became a center of whispered theories and cautious accusations. Villagers clustered in small groups, each convinced of their own interpretation of events. Mrs. Primrose, the local dressmaker, leaned toward Mrs. Elspeth Crawley. "It's obvious to me, Elspeth. That young Lydia Markham, she's hiding something. You could see it in her eyes when Eleanor fell. She knows more than she lets on." Elspeth shook her head. "Oh, Primrose, always so quick to judge. Lydia has been nothing but polite and diligent. I dare say you're reading shadows." Yet shadows were exactly what Miss Marple noticed. She had no intention of accusing anyone prematurely, but she observed keenly the quick glances, the whispered half-sentences, the subtle movements of hands and feet. Near the refreshment table, the vicar's niece, Miss Felicity Caldwell, spoke in low tones to a cluster of young women. "I overheard that Mr. Langford was not particularly fond of Mrs. Godfrey. He returned only last month, and there were complications. People say he inherited something from a distant relative, something she contested." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "A family dispute, inheritance complications. Such matters often concealed motives more potent than outward hostility suggested." She made a mental note, letting the information settle. Meanwhile, the local schoolmaster, Mr. Philip Yates, discussed the incident with the postmistress, Mrs. Thompson. "I cannot understand it," he said, shaking his head. "Eleanor Godfrey was well liked, at least on the surface. Who could wish her harm?" Mrs. Thompson shrugged. "People hide behind smiles and ribbons, Philip. There's always more than meets the eye. Always." Miss Marple, perched in a corner with her knitting, found herself listening to all of these fragments, stitching them together silently. She did not interject, did not offer her own conjectures. She had long ago learned that people reveal their secrets willingly if one only paid attention, if one only waited. By the time tea was finished and the hall began to empty, the village had settled into a restless lull. The gossip had multiplied in layers. Some feared for their own safety, some speculated about scandal, and others, like Mrs. Hollowell, seemed almost satisfied that order might soon be restored, preferably without her own position compromised. Outside, snow began to fall softly, blanketing the village in a delicate, silent sheet. Street lamps cast golden circles through the drifting flakes, and Miss Marple, stepping outside for a breath of the cold night air, noted the serene beauty of it all. A beauty that belied the undercurrents of human ambition, jealousy, and hidden resentment. She thought again of Lydia Markham and Edward Langford, of Mrs. Hollowell and the other villagers whose words and expressions had betrayed more than they intended. Something was off, Miss Marple concluded, though she could not yet articulate what. And in the heart of the quiet village, beneath the falling snow and the sleeping rooftops, the first threads of a very tangled story were beginning to tighten. Yes, thought Miss Marple, observing a flicker of movement in a shadowed window. There is more here than meets the eye, and if she was correct, which she often was, the village would not soon forget the night of the Candlelight Service, not for its warmth, not for its carols, but for the scandal it had unexpectedly ignited. By the following morning, St. Aldwyn-on-Avon had awakened to a world subtly altered. The snow from the previous night still clung to hedges and rooftops, glinting in the pale winter sun, but the village's familiar rhythm had been fractured. Conversations in the market square were hushed, and the baker's usual jokes were replaced by anxious murmurs. Even the children who might have been sledding or building snowmen skulked close to their parents, wide-eyed at the talk of Eleanor Godfrey's sudden death. Miss Marple, who had spent the night quietly reviewing the events of the Candlelight Service, felt a familiar stir of curiosity. She had always observed that the early hours after a tragedy were revealing. People who believed they had nothing to hide often showed cracks in their composure, their habits betraying small truths that could later become the key to unraveling a mystery. Her first stop was the church itself. Reverend Caldwell was already there, pacing near the altar, his brow furrowed. The wooden pews bore the marks of hastily extinguished candles, and a faint trace of wax had dripped onto the stone floor. Miss Marple noted these details quietly. They were inconsequential in themselves, but in a case of human intrigue, nothing was truly insignificant. "Jane, I'm so glad you've come," the vicar said, clasping her hands nervously. "I confess I don't know what to make of it. Eleanor, she was always dignified, careful, proper. Who could have wished her harm?" Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "People often wear masks, Reverend, and sometimes even the most careful masks cannot conceal what is beneath." Before Reverend Caldwell could respond, Mrs. Beatrice Hollowell arrived, her coat dusted with snow, her expression perfectly composed. She held a clipboard as if ready to record every observation. "I've taken the liberty of cataloguing the seating arrangements from last night," she said briskly. "It may assist the authorities. We should not rely solely on conjecture." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled ever so slightly. "Very thorough, Mrs. Hollowell. That will be useful, I'm sure. But there are matters even the most meticulous lists cannot capture." Beatrice Hollowell's lips pressed together in a tight line, though she said nothing, and the vicar simply nodded, unsure whether to look reassured or alarmed. Miss Marple began her quiet rounds of the church, pausing at each pew, each corner, as if examining the building for structural flaws or spiritual residue. Yet what she truly examined were the traces left behind by human behavior. A candle knocked slightly off-center in one pew, a scarf draped carelessly over the edge of a bench, a hymnbook turned backward. These were not evidence in a forensic sense, but they spoke volumes about movements, intentions, and disturbances at the moment of crisis. It was in this silent inspection that she first noticed Lydia Markham entering the church, accompanied by the police constable, Mr. Hawkins. The young woman moved with careful grace, yet there was a tension in her shoulders, a rigidity in her step. She nodded politely to Miss Marple, and the older woman returned the gesture without comment. "Miss Markham," Constable Hawkins began, in the cautious manner of a man unused to interrogating the well-bred, "I hope you can answer a few questions regarding last night. Nothing formal, just a few observations." Lydia's hands clutched the edge of her coat. "Of course," she said softly, her voice steady despite the obvious strain. Miss Marple watched silently as the questioning unfolded. Lydia answered with precision, careful to avoid embellishment, careful not to reveal what might be construed as personal feelings. Miss Marple, however, observed her eyes. The flickers of hesitation, the subtle downward glance toward the chancel, and the momentary tightening of her lips. Small gestures, almost imperceptible, yet telling to someone who had learned to read the language of human behavior. Meanwhile, Mr. Edward Langford had arrived, impeccably dressed, his expression composed but thoughtful. He moved among the church, greeting a few familiar faces, exchanging brief words with the vicar. Yet even in these brief interactions, Miss Marple noted something in his demeanor, a careful control, as if his every movement were calculated to avoid drawing suspicion. There was an intelligence in his calm, a self-awareness that might serve him well or perhaps hide his true motives. Outside the church, the villagers had begun to gather, curious, concerned, or, in some cases, eager to insert themselves into the unfolding drama. Mrs. Primrose, the dressmaker, whispered conspiratorially to Mrs. Elspeth Crawley about Lydia Markham's possible involvement. Mrs. Hollowell, conversely, made a point of observing these whispers, her eyes sharp, her lips pursed. Miss Marple chose to watch from the shadows. There was a delicate ballet in human behavior when fear and suspicion intertwined. Some sought to dominate the narrative, others to remain invisible, and the subtle interplay of these desires often revealed more than direct questioning ever could. By mid-morning, the coroner's assistant arrived to examine the scene. Dr. Harris, who had been first to attend Mrs. Godfrey, was present, taking notes and discussing preliminary observations with the vicar and Constable Hawkins. Miss Marple lingered at a respectful distance, listening quietly. "The cause of death appears sudden," Dr. Harris murmured. "No obvious external injury, though I will reserve final judgment until a proper examination is conducted. However, there is something about the circumstances that suggests an element of human interference." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. She had anticipated as much. It was never enough to rely solely on appearances, for appearances often concealed the truth. What mattered were the invisible threads, a glance, a pause, a gesture, things that people overlooked, dismissed, or considered trivial. She turned her attention briefly to the pews, the hymnals, and the faint wax drippings. Something tugged at her memory, an incident from many years ago in a neighboring village where a seemingly accidental slip had concealed a far more deliberate act. Such recollections, she knew, were invaluable when carefully applied. By late morning, the villagers had returned home, murmuring to one another, speculating wildly, each convinced of their own interpretation. Rumors spread that Eleanor had enemies, that Lydia Markham and Edward Langford were involved in some hidden quarrel, that Mrs. Hollowell's composure was evidence of concealed knowledge. Miss Marple, however, remained detached. She understood that the villagers' interpretations, while colourful, were often flawed. People tended to see the world not as it was, but as they wished it to be, and within those errors of judgment lay the seeds of insight, if one knew how to look. Returning to Mrs. Weatherford's house for a quiet lunch, Miss Marple found a moment to consider all she had observed: the trembling hands, the furtive glances, the composure of those who claimed none was necessary. She noted who lingered near others, who avoided contact, and who spoke in careful neutrality. There was much to unravel. Yet Miss Marple felt no urgency, not in the sense of panic at least. In mysteries, as in life, the truth revealed itself most clearly to those patient enough to watch and listen. And watch she would, and listen. For already, in the small village of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon, threads were beginning to form. Threads that, if pulled carefully, would lead to a truth far darker and more intricate than anyone suspected. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the fire, simply allowed herself a small, inward smile. The game, she knew, had only just begun. By the second day after the candlelight service, the village of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon had settled into a curious mixture of shock and speculation. The initial horror of Mrs. Eleanor Godfrey's sudden death was beginning to evolve into tentative theories, most of them wildly divergent. Yet amidst the gossip and conjecture, two figures had begun to emerge in the collective imagination of the villagers as the likely culprits, though Miss Marple knew better than to accept the obvious at face value. The first suspect, according to local chatter, was Lydia Markham. The young music instructor had been present at the service, visibly agitated, and her eyes had betrayed a mixture of grief and unease that some interpreted as guilt. Mrs. Primrose, the dressmaker, had declared to anyone who would listen that Lydia's nervous demeanour was evidence enough. She looked ready to bolt the moment Eleanor fell. Mrs. Primrose insisted over tea with Mrs. Elspeth Crawley. "And have you noticed how she avoids Mr. Langford? She knows something, I tell you." Elspeth shook her head, though she was far from certain herself. "Perhaps it is grief, Primrose. Not every tremor signifies guilt." Miss Marple, seated quietly nearby and pretending to examine her knitting, noted the intensity with which villagers were projecting their interpretations onto Lydia. She made no comment, allowing the chatter to flow past her, like threads of information to be picked apart later. Meanwhile, the other obvious suspect in everyone's eyes was Edward Langford. He had returned to St. Aldwyn only recently, inheriting distant property and, as rumour had it, entangled in old family disagreements. His presence in the church that night, coupled with his sharp composure in the aftermath, made him seem either heroic or cunningly detached, depending on one's perspective. "I saw him standing near Lydia. Yes, but did anyone see him near Eleanor?" Mrs. Hollowell inquired, speaking to a small cluster of villagers. "No, indeed, but one must wonder why his attention was elsewhere. Suspicious, surely." Miss Marple observed the murmurs, but allowed them to pass without acknowledgement. Both young Lydia and Mr. Langford exhibited behaviour that, on the surface, could be read as incriminating, but the older woman knew that guilt was rarely so transparent. It hid behind clever composure, calculated gestures, and careful speech. Later that morning, Constable Hawkins visited Mrs. Weatherford's house to collect preliminary statements. Miss Marple was present, of course, though she neither prompted nor interfered. Hawkins, a conscientious man but limited in intuition, approached Lydia first. "Miss Markham," he said formally, "we must understand the circumstances of Mrs. Godfrey's collapse. Anything you recall, anything at all, could be vital." Lydia's voice was measured, almost rehearsed. I was performing with the choir when it happened. I noticed nothing unusual prior to her falling. I only tried to help." Her hands, folded neatly in front of her, betrayed a faint quiver, enough to set certain villagers' imaginations alight. Hawkins nodded, scribbling notes with a frown. "Thank you. You will be asked to remain available for further questions." Next, he turned to Edward Langford. Mr. Langford's expression was calm, almost aloof, but Miss Marple noticed the subtle shift in his eyes when Lydia was mentioned. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but to her it spoke volumes. "I was near the rear," Langford explained evenly. "I had no interaction with Mrs. Godfrey beyond passing acknowledgement. I left the rest to the vicar and his parishioners." Hawkins nodded, though his frown deepened. The statement was perfectly plausible. But Miss Marple, listening quietly, detected a careful precision in every word, a deliberate control over what was said and what was left unsaid. By midday, the village press, the small local newsletter, had already begun to circulate preliminary accounts. Headlines suggested that Mrs. Godfrey's death was under suspicious circumstances, and naturally both Lydia and Langford were highlighted in the reports. The coverage fueled speculation, setting the stage for whispered conversations at every corner. Miss Marple, however, focused not on the immediate assumptions, but on the patterns she observed, who spoke first, whose stories aligned with others, and whose discomfort seemed genuine. Later in the afternoon, she visited the Godfrey estate under the guise of offering condolences. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, was a stern woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense approach to both domestic affairs and gossip. She welcomed Miss Marple politely, but with visible tension. "I suppose you've heard all the tales, Miss Marple," Mrs. Fenwick said, carefully polishing the silver tray as she spoke. "People believe Lydia had some quarrel with Mrs. Godfrey, and of course, Edward Langford. That one's been talked about endlessly. I can't say I approve of these insinuations." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I expect people talk, but truth is rarely as simple as the first guess, Mrs. Fenwick." "Indeed," the housekeeper replied. "But if it were simple, someone would have explained it by now. The police can't make sense of it either. They ask questions, yes, but they rely on statements rather than observation. And observation, Miss Marple, is what would uncover the truth." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "Quite right, one must observe, and then one must wait." She lingered in the house for some time, noting small things. A book open at the edge of a writing desk, a teacup slightly chipped, a window left ajar despite the winter chill. All minor details, perhaps, but as she knew, these seemingly trivial matters often illuminated the unseen currents of human behavior. As the day drew on, the village seemed divided. Some villagers were convinced that Lydia, with her nervous demeanor, held guilt. Others, more inclined toward social reasoning, whispered of Langford's possible motives regarding inheritance or property. There were even murmurs about Mrs. Hollowell herself, whose calmness and efficiency during the crisis some interpreted as an attempt to manipulate the situation. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in Mrs. Weatherford's parlor that evening, reflected on all she'd seen. She had no intention of rushing to judgment. There were many threads, and the first suspects were often the most misleading. True understanding, she knew, required patience and an eye for the subtle interplay of character and circumstance. By nightfall, she had begun to form tentative ideas, not accusations, not conclusions, but a mental map of relationships, tensions, and potential motives. Each individual carried their own secrets, their own hidden resentments. And in a village as small as St. Aldwyn, secrets never stayed hidden for long, though they might be concealed behind politeness, fear, or simple habit. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the flicker of a candle flame from the weathered window of Mrs. Hollowell's home across the street. Perhaps she was reading, perhaps writing, perhaps simply watching. One could never tell. And that, thought Miss Marple, was precisely the point. The first suspects had been named by gossip, by rumor, and by casual observation, but Miss Marple suspected, and quietly, with that calm certainty she always carried, that the truth would lie elsewhere. Somewhere beneath the surface of the village's polite exterior, a far more intricate story was unfolding, and it would be her task, as always, to untangle it. The morning after the first round of questioning, St. Aldwyn-on-Avon was already buzzing with cautious curiosity. The village, small and intimate, thrived on observation and conjecture, yet few suspected how much Miss Marple had quietly absorbed the previous day. She had noted the obvious behaviors of Lydia Markham, Edward Langford, and even Mrs. Hollowell, but she also knew that in any intricate affair, the smallest, seemingly inconsequential detail could become the key to unraveling the whole. Miss Marple had gone for a solitary walk, her woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her steps measured and thoughtful. She wandered past the edge of the churchyard, where frost clung to the gravestones like lace, and past the hedge-lined lanes where snow still glittered under a pale morning sun. Her eyes, alert yet gentle, swept over familiar scenes. The children trudging to school, the postman delivering letters, the baker's assistant sweeping the steps with nervous energy. She noticed the little anomalies that others ignored. A footprint smudged in the fresh snow, a gate left slightly ajar, a handkerchief caught on a branch. Each item, each gesture, contributed a small, vital thread to the story that was slowly revealing itself. It was near the church vestry that she noticed it first, a subtle, almost imperceptible detail. A small scrap of paper lodged between the folds of a hymn book that had been set aside after the service. Miss Marple bent down, picking it up delicately. It was an envelope, unmarked, but containing a single sheet of handwritten notes. The handwriting was neat, careful, almost excessively so, and the words themselves seemed ordinary at first glance. Yet upon reading, Miss Marple's sharp mind registered the significance immediately. The note referenced an appointment, a meeting at the church on the evening of the service, not for song practice or parish duties, but something more clandestine. A name was mentioned, one that no one had yet connected with the tragic event. A small phrase underlined in faint pencil suggested secrecy, urgency, and a plan to confront or discuss a delicate matter. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, quietly cataloguing possibilities. The note had been overlooked precisely because it appeared mundane. To most, it would have been dismissed as routine or trivial correspondence. Yet she knew better. Villagers were not careful in their assumptions, and a carefully disguised detail could evade even the most attentive eyes unless one specifically sought it. Returning to Mrs. Weatherford's house, Miss Marple shared the discovery in a controlled manner, avoiding any hint of alarm. "Caroline," she said gently, "sometimes the most telling evidence is hidden in plain sight. One must not always expect to find it in a dramatic or violent act. Often it is a small slip, an overlooked paper, or a casual remark that reveals the truth." Mrs. Weatherford's eyes widened. Do you think this could help the police?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "But it is far too soon to be certain. One must consider both motive and opportunity, and the subtle patterns of human behavior often indicate more than a single piece of paper ever could." As the day unfolded, Miss Marple continued her observations, weaving her way through the village with quiet diligence. At the bakery, she noticed the way the assistant's hand trembled when delivering bread to Edward Langford's household. At the post office, she noted the precise timing of Lydia Markham's visits, which coincided curiously with the delivery of letters. Each observation, when considered individually, might have seemed inconsequential. Together, however, they formed a lattice of subtle interactions and hidden intentions. By afternoon, she had arranged to meet Lydia under the guise of social politeness, inviting her for tea at Mrs. Weatherford's parlour. The young music instructor arrived, hesitant yet composed, carrying herself with the decorum of a woman unused to scrutiny. Miss Marple allowed her to speak freely, asking only gentle, seemingly innocent questions. "Lydia, my dear," she said, pouring tea with care, "I wondered if you noticed anything unusual during the service yesterday, anything at all that seemed out of place." Lydia hesitated, fingering the edge of her coat. "Nothing that I can recall," she said softly. I was so focused on singing and then on helping Mrs. Godfrey, I hardly noticed anything else." Miss Marple observed her carefully. There was truth in her words, and yet something restrained her, a subtle hesitation, a glance that flitted briefly toward the window as though measuring distance and timing. Miss Marple made a mental note. Often, hesitation was not merely nervousness. It was the reflection of concealed awareness. Later, she visited Edward Langford, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the upcoming memorial service. His demeanor remained composed, though Miss Marple noticed a faint crease at the corner of his mouth when Lydia's name was mentioned. Subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it spoke to a relationship not openly acknowledged. The interaction suggested careful calculation, someone considering how to maintain appearances while managing undisclosed tensions. Returning home, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries. The small scrap of paper in the hymn book, the unguarded glances, the subtle shifts in expression, all indicated the presence of knowledge previously concealed. She realized that these minor clues, often ignored by others, were quietly converging toward a revelation. The significance of the note became clearer that evening when she compared it mentally with the seating arrangements, the movements of individuals during the service, and the timing of interactions afterward. It suggested that Eleanor Godfrey's death, sudden and shocking as it appeared, was not purely accidental. Someone had intended to act, or at the very least, to manipulate circumstances in a way that could have led to tragedy. Miss Marple's intuition told her that she was close to understanding the underlying motive. She did not yet know the full sequence of events, but she had identified a thread, delicate, almost invisible, that connected the victims, the suspects, and the hidden tensions simmering beneath St. Aldwyn's polite exterior. For the first time, she allowed herself a small, inward smile. The game, intricate and delicate, was becoming clearer. The hidden clue had illuminated a path forward, one that required patience, observation, and careful engagement with the human element. Yes, she thought, as she set aside her knitting and studied the flickering candlelight of the evening. The truth is always in the details, and in this quiet village, the smallest detail, often overlooked, often underestimated, was beginning to reveal the outlines of a far deeper intrigue than anyone yet suspected. And Miss Marple, ever vigilant, was ready to follow it wherever it might lead. By midweek, St. Aldwyn-on-Avon was no longer merely whispering about Mrs. Godfrey's death. It was buzzing with speculation, conjecture, and unspoken accusations. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly through this storm of gossip, observing the subtle interplay of personalities rather than giving herself over to panic or rumor. The first confrontation came unexpectedly. Mrs. Beatrice Hollowell, her composure now slightly frayed by the relentless curiosity of the villagers, approached Miss Marple one afternoon at Mrs. Weatherford's garden gate. "Jane," she said sharply, "I do not know why you insist on sitting quietly while everyone else draws conclusions, but there are things you ought to know, secrets that may affect your investigations." Miss Marple looked up calmly, her hands folded over a basket of knitting. "Oh, Mrs. Hollowell, you know I'm always grateful for information. But secrets, by nature, tend to reveal themselves when the time is right. Perhaps you could start by telling me what you mean." Beatrice hesitated, glancing around as though the snow-laden hedges themselves might be listening. "It concerns Eleanor Godfrey," she admitted finally, her voice lowering. "She was difficult, and she had knowledge of other people's affairs, things some of us would rather remain hidden." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. That aligned with her own observations. People who keep close track of others' actions often find themselves enmeshed in the consequences when misfortune strikes. "What sort of knowledge?" Miss Marple asked softly, as though indulging idle curiosity. Beatrice swallowed. She knew about Edward Langford's past in London, about Lydia Markham's family connections, even about minor scandals in the parish. Eleanor took it upon herself to be the arbiter of propriety, the keeper of secrets, and not everyone appreciated that. Miss Marple's mind quietly catalogued each piece of information. Eleanor's awareness of Edward's and Lydia's pasts could explain tensions that were invisible to most villagers, and when someone feels threatened by exposure, actions, sometimes drastic, can follow. Later that day, Miss Marple visited Lydia Markham at her small, neat residence near the school. She arrived under the guise of inviting her for afternoon tea, but the conversation inevitably veered toward Eleanor Godfrey. "You must forgive the village, Lydia," Miss Marple said as they settled into the warm parlor. "They are fond of assuming the worst, but some truths, if shared carelessly, can have consequences. Did Mrs. Godfrey ever discuss any troubling matters with you?" Lydia's hands clutched the teacup tightly. She occasionally mentioned difficulties at school, small disputes or misunderstandings among the children," she admitted. "But nothing that would cause harm. I never expected this." Her voice faltered. "I did feel nervous. I didn't understand her sometimes. She had a way of noticing things and speaking of them in ways that made me feel inadequate." Miss Marple observed her closely. A subtle blush crept across Lydia's cheeks, but her eyes, clear and honest, did not waver from the older woman's. There was no deception, only the tremor of someone caught in fear and grief. From Lydia, Miss Marple also gathered insight into her relationship with Edward Langford. There was admiration, yes, and a faint tension, perhaps the remnants of a misunderstanding or unspoken words, yet nothing pointed toward malice or premeditation. By mid-afternoon, Edward himself visited Mrs. Weatherford's home, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for a memorial service. Miss Marple, always composed, welcomed him cordially. "Edward," she said, pouring tea, "I hope you do not mind my curiosity. People are naturally talking about the recent events, and some things, though minor, deserve clarification." Edward's expression remained neutral, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. "I understand, Miss Marple. I assure you, I had no interaction with Mrs. Godfrey beyond polite acknowledgement during the service. Any rumors to the contrary are unfortunate." Miss Marple's gaze, however, lingered thoughtfully. There was nothing aggressive or defensive in his words, yet she remembered Mrs. Hollowell's comment about Edward's past and Eleanor's knowledge. Secrets had a way of influencing behavior subtly, like currents beneath calm water. That evening, Miss Marple convened a small gathering at Mrs. Weatherford's parlor. Lydia, Edward, Mrs. Hollowell, and a few other villagers who were closely involved in the events attended. It was ostensibly social, yet under the guise of conversation, Miss Marple subtly steered discussions, testing reactions and revealing hidden tensions. "Tell me," she said softly, "how well did everyone know Mrs. Godfrey? Did she ever make remarks that seemed trivial at the time but now might have caused unease?" Mrs. Hollowell's lips pressed tightly together, as if she were trying to suppress a sigh. Lydia's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her scarf, and Edward leaned slightly forward, attentive yet controlled. "Eleanor had a way," Lydia admitted. "Sometimes she mentioned things about people, small matters, but they carried weight. You didn't realize at the time how much it might affect others. And in her role," Miss Marple continued quietly, "as someone who observed closely, she may have caused tensions without intending to." Edward's gaze briefly flickered to Lydia, subtle, almost imperceptible. "She could be sharp," he said evenly. "But I do not believe anyone intended harm, at least not in any direct, deliberate way." Miss Marple nodded, knitting her brow thoughtfully. She noted every glance, every slight shift of posture, every pause in speech. Each reaction hinted at secrets, at interpersonal dynamics layered beneath the polite surface of the village. Later, as the visitors departed, Miss Marple lingered by the fire. She reflected on what she had observed: Eleanor's role as a keeper of secrets, the unspoken tensions between Lydia and Edward, Mrs. Hollowell's sharp awareness of everything, and the minor inconsistencies and stories that hinted at concealment rather than accident. In small villages, she knew, the past never truly disappeared. Small grievances accumulated quietly, festering beneath the civility of polite conversation. And when combined with a sudden event, like Eleanor Godfrey's collapse, those hidden resentments could ripple outward, altering perceptions, alliances, and even behavior. Miss Marple also understood another vital point. Confrontations often brought out truths more revealing than statements made in isolation. People, when pressed or observed in social interplay, betrayed small hints of their deeper intentions and fears. And so, by the end of the day, she had formed the beginnings of a delicate map of the village's tangled relationships. The first suspects, the obvious points of suspicion, were only pieces in a larger puzzle, pieces that could mislead anyone who failed to observe closely. Miss Marple, as always, preferred patience. She knew the layers of secrecy, resentment, and unspoken motives would eventually reveal themselves if watched with care. And she, more than anyone, was willing to wait for the moment when the smallest, seemingly trivial detail would illuminate the path to the truth. For in St. Aldwyn-on-Avon, as in all small communities, the shadows of the past and present were intertwined. And behind polite smiles and careful gestures, hidden currents of human nature flowed silently, waiting to be understood. Miss Marple, seated by the flickering fire, quietly stitched her knitting, her mind piecing together the subtle signals she had observed. The confrontation had provided more than words. It had provided insight, hints, and the faint outlines of secrets waiting to surface. And somewhere in the shadows of the village, the truth waited, just as patient as she was. By Thursday morning, the villagers of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon had grown accustomed to a low hum of unease, though they believed the worst of the tragedy had passed. Yet Miss Marple knew that in mysteries of human design, the most significant revelations often arrived unexpectedly, like a shadow shifting across the face of a calm pond. It was at the village school that the first new shock occurred. Lydia Markham, attending to a group of restless children during music practice, noticed an envelope slipped under the door of the classroom. The paper, crisp and formally addressed, bore no signature, only a terse instruction. "Meet at the church tonight, alone." Her first instinct was alarm, and yet curiosity stirred. She carefully examined the envelope. The handwriting seemed familiar but deliberately obscured, and the tone suggested urgency. Lydia hesitated, weighing the risks of acting alone against the consequences of ignoring the message. By the time Miss Marple visited the school later that afternoon to speak with Lydia about arrangements for the memorial service, the young teacher's distress was evident. "Jane, Lydia began, her voice wavering slightly. She showed the envelope to Miss Marple. "I don't know who could have sent this. Miss Marple accepted it calmly, her eyes narrowing subtly as she examined the handwriting. "It is certainly deliberate," she murmured, "and the intent is clear, to elicit action without witnesses. That is, of course, unsettling, but not necessarily sinister." Lydia's brow furrowed. "Not sinister. Jane, someone clearly wants me there tonight, alone. How can that not be sinister?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Sometimes, my dear, messages like this serve as tests, not traps. They provoke, they stir, they reveal character. Let us consider why someone might seek you out. We need only observe before assuming intention." Later that evening, the villagers gathered at the Godfrey estate for the memorial, unaware of the subtle tension brewing behind the scenes. The service was small, solemn, and respectful, yet Miss Marple detected undercurrents among the attendees. Mrs. Hollowell appeared more tense than before, carefully arranging seating and supervising the flow of conversation. Edward Langford's hands, though perfectly steady, occasionally twitched toward the pocket where he kept his gloves. Lydia, pale but composed, offered polite acknowledgments while keeping her thoughts inward. The true twist, however, arrived unexpectedly. Just as the vicar concluded the final prayer, a sharp knock sounded at the door. The small gathering fell silent. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, moved cautiously to open it, revealing a figure that had not been seen in the village for over a decade. Mr. Harold Pemberton, formerly a prosperous businessman in London, known for his fiery temper and notorious quarrels with Eleanor Godfrey. A collective gasp swept through the room. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were steady. She had been expecting someone with knowledge of Eleanor's past to reappear. The threads of history often returned in small villages to tangle the present. Excuse me," Mr. Pemberton began, his voice slightly hoarse from disuse, yet firm. "I was told by someone here that Mrs. Godfrey, that she passed away. I needed to see for myself." Edward Langford's eyes narrowed slightly, though his composure remained intact. "Mr. Pemberton," he said smoothly, "you have returned at a difficult time." "Yes, well," Pemberton replied, glancing around. "The village has changed little, but some faces are familiar." His gaze lingered briefly on Lydia, who instinctively stepped back, though her demeanor remained polite. Miss Marple, as always, observed quietly. She noted the way Pemberton's hands fidgeted at his coat lapels, the subtle avoidance of eye contact when mentioning Eleanor, and the slight hesitation when speaking about his reason for visiting. The smallest movements betrayed tension, intent, and perhaps lingering resentment. Before the evening could settle, another disturbance arose. A second envelope, this one discovered by Mrs. Hollowell in the vicar's study, contained a brief, cryptic note. "The truth lies where light and shadow meet." Its meaning was opaque, yet the placement suggested deliberate intent to provoke inquiry. Miss Marple held it carefully, letting her mind trace the possibilities. Whoever had sent it had an understanding of human curiosity, of the natural inclination to seek meaning even where it might not be immediately apparent. It was a clever diversion, or careful lure toward revelation. The village hall, which had been prepared for refreshments after the memorial, became the stage for subtle confrontations. Whispers escalated, glances were exchanged, and tensions rose, though Miss Marple maintained her calm. She watched Lydia's posture, noting the slight stiffness in her back. She observed Edward's hands, noting the fleeting tension in his fingers. She observed Mrs. Hollowell's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanning everyone in the room as if measuring their intentions. The real twist, however, unfolded when Lydia received a private summons from an anonymous source, delivered during the gathering. She hesitated, and Miss Marple, standing quietly nearby, saw the decision being made in microseconds, the choice to confront, to obey, or to deflect. This subtle drama revealed as much about the human psyche as any confession or statement could. "Jane," Lydia whispered, glancing at Miss Marple. "I'm supposed to go to the church, alone. I don't know if I should." Miss Marple's voice was steady. "Sometimes one learns more from going than from staying, but it is always wise to proceed with observation and caution. Remember, the sender intends a reaction as much as an action. Watch, but do not act rashly." As Lydia departed cautiously for the church under the fading light of winter, Miss Marple remained behind, knitting quietly in a corner of the village hall. She observed the villagers who remained, their anxious glances, whispered speculations, and the subtle gestures that betrayed their awareness of the tension. Outside, the shadows lengthened, mingling with the flickering gas lamps. Snow, disturbed by evening wind, danced along the cobblestones. Miss Marple's eyes followed Lydia's figure, slender and cautious, moving along the edge of the churchyard. The envelope's instructions had set a trap, or perhaps, more accurately, a stage. And Miss Marple knew, as she had often known, that in such small villages, the truth rarely revealed itself directly. It came in twists, in diversions, in subtle provocations. Each layer peeled back only when observed with patience, intelligence, and a deep understanding of human nature. Tonight, she realized, would likely reveal far more than the previous days had. A new player had entered the stage. New motives, old grudges, and hidden tensions were converging. The village's polite exterior was about to be pierced by subtle, almost imperceptible revelations. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, allowed herself a small, inward smile. The twist, she knew, was only the beginning. And in the shadows of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon, the true depth of the intrigue was beginning to show its shape. The following morning, a brittle frost covered the village of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon, the kind that made every branch, roof, and hedge glint with an almost deceptive calm. Villagers went about their routines, but under polite conversation and orderly steps lay a simmering tension that only Miss Marple seemed fully aware of. She had observed patterns, decoded small gestures, and catalogued the interactions that hinted at motives. Yet to reveal the truth, she knew, one needed a careful, deliberate strategy, a test that would prompt the guilty to betray themselves. Miss Marple began by inviting the key figures to a seemingly ordinary tea at Mrs. Weatherford's parlour. Lydia Markham, Edward Langford, and Mrs. Hollowell accepted politely, unaware that the session was anything but casual. Miss Marple greeted them warmly, offering tea and biscuits, her knitting resting in her lap, her demeanour perfectly composed. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle, almost conversational. "I thought it might be pleasant to gather and speak of ordinary matters for a change. The weather, the children, the parish events." She smiled softly, allowing her words to drift past her guests, inviting them to relax, but carefully watching how each responded. Lydia's hands fidgeted slightly, though she attempted to mask it with polite composure. Edward remained perfectly still, though his eyes flickered toward both women as if assessing their reactions. Mrs. Hollowell, as usual, maintained a calm facade, but Miss Marple detected a tautness around the mouth and a restless shift of weight from foot to foot. Miss Marple's mind, ever alert, catalogued these subtleties while maintaining an appearance of idle chatter. She spoke of minor parish matters, interspersed with subtle, seemingly offhand references to Eleanor Godfrey's habits and last interactions. Each mention was measured, precise, and designed to test reactions rather than elicit information directly. "Lydia," she said quietly, "you must have noticed how observant Mrs. Godfrey was. She had a way of noticing things most people overlooked." Lydia nodded, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "Yes, she was always attentive. Sometimes a little too much, perhaps." Miss Marple allowed the remark to pass without comment. Observation alone was insufficient. She needed confirmation, a subtle confirmation from behavior rather than words. She shifted her attention to Edward. "And you, Edward," she continued gently, "I imagine you had many interactions with Eleanor in London. Did she ever speak of her concerns or of others in the parish?" Edward's hands moved imperceptibly, adjusting his gloves. "Occasionally," he admitted, though his tone was calm. "She was very particular about propriety, but nothing serious, nothing that would lead to harm, I can assure you." Miss Marple observed the fleeting micro-expression, a quick tightening around the eyes, a slight pause before speaking. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone untrained in reading human behavior, yet she noted it carefully. Finally, she addressed Mrs. Hollowell, the woman whose poise had often concealed a keen awareness. "And you, Beatrice? I understand you were quite involved in ensuring everything went smoothly during the service. It is a delicate position, managing both the proceedings and the people. One must be attentive to details that others might miss." Mrs. Hollowell's response was precise, deliberate. "Yes, of course. I observed, made sure everything was in order. It was unfortunate, of course, but there was nothing untoward that I saw. At least nothing obvious." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Of course. Sometimes the smallest things escape notice, and yet it is often in those smallest details that one finds the truth." As she spoke, her words acted like a subtle probe. Each person, intentionally or not, revealed more than they realized. Lydia's fingers now tapped lightly against a teacup, a rhythmic signal of anxiety. Edward's eyes flicked toward the door as if imagining escape or confrontation. Mrs. Hollowell's hands, resting neatly on the table, twitched imperceptibly as she straightened a teacup. Miss Marple allowed the room to settle, then continued with careful precision. "You see, in small villages, secrets have a way of lingering. People speak, they whisper, they watch one another, and sometimes the most innocent of gestures reveals the deepest of intentions. I find it fascinating how human behavior often betrays the inner mind, even when the mind wishes to conceal it." Her tone was calm, her eyes bright with subtle amusement, but there was steel beneath the surface. She was not merely observing, she was conducting an experiment, a test of reactions that would reveal the guilty party's composure, or their lack thereof. Then she allowed a small silence to descend. It was intentional, a pressure point in the social fabric of the room. Silence in a small gathering, after gentle but pointed observations, could be more revealing than direct questioning. It was Lydia who finally reacted first. Her lips parted slightly, a small involuntary gasp escaping, her hands trembling in a way no amount of composure could entirely suppress. Miss Marple noticed immediately, noting both the gesture and the rapid flicker of worry in her eyes. Edward, though calm, subtly leaned forward, his fingers drumming lightly against the table, almost a signal of readiness, perhaps even calculation. Mrs. Hollowell remained still, her poise intact, but there was a brief flash of something in her eyes. Mild surprise, the slightest contraction of her brow, that suggested awareness beyond mere social etiquette. Miss Marple allowed the tension to hang in the air for a few moments longer. Each subtle reaction, each micro-expression was a thread she could follow. Then, with perfect casualness, she introduced a final, carefully constructed element to her test. "Earlier this week," she said softly, "an envelope appeared under Lydia's door, instructing her to go to the church alone. A clever ruse, I thought, to provoke curiosity and perhaps fear. It reminds me that sometimes the sender of such messages wishes to observe, rather than act directly. How fascinating to see what humans reveal when prompted with subtle pressure, don't you agree?" The room shifted imperceptibly. Lydia's fingers gripped her teacup harder. Edward's jaw tightened slightly, though his words remained composed. Mrs. Hollowell's lips pressed together, her eyes scanning, analyzing, calculating. Miss Marple allowed a small smile to play on her lips. She had not yet revealed the truth, nor accused anyone directly. Instead, she had created the conditions for observation, a careful orchestration of social pressure, gentle provocations, and subtle psychological cues. From this, the guilty party, or the party with most to hide, would betray themselves in ways that could not be wholly controlled. As the tea progressed, the micro-gestures continued, revealing more than words ever could. And Miss Marple, ever patient, observed, catalogued, and waited. She understood that in mysteries of human design, the truth could not be forced. It had to be invited, carefully, delicately, and in a manner that allowed human nature to reveal itself. Tonight, she reflected, would provide the final hints needed to untangle the web of secrets, resentments, and hidden motives that lay beneath the polite veneer of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon. And when the time came, she would reveal the truth with gentle precision, leaving no question unanswered, no action unexplained. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet satisfaction. The final test was in motion, and the guilty party would soon reveal themselves, unguarded, under the weight of their own concealed intentions. The evening was unusually still, the snow-covered village of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon enveloped in a quiet that seemed almost conspiratorial. Inside Mrs. Weatherford's parlour, the group gathered once more, the flickering lamplight casting gentle shadows on the walls. Miss Marple, her knitting set aside, had invited everyone for a final conversation, not to interrogate, but to orchestrate the conditions under which truth would naturally emerge. Lydia, Markham sat near the window, fingers interlaced, eyes wide but controlled. Edward Langford occupied a chair close to the fire, calm yet subtly tense. Mrs. Hollowell's poise remained impeccable, but her hands rested tensely on the armrests, betraying the slightest unease. Even the vicar, who had been quietly observing, seemed aware that this meeting carried significance beyond mere social courtesy. Miss Marple began gently. "It has been a curious week, has it not? A small village disrupted by events we did not expect, and yet, as we have observed, human nature does not change. It reveals itself, often in the most subtle ways." She paused, allowing the words to settle, like a soft weight pressing on the room. "We have all been attentive to small gestures, casual remarks, the behavior of others under pressure. It is remarkable what can be learned without asking direct questions, is it not?" Lydia's fingers fidgeted slightly. Edward's eyes flicked toward her, though his expression remained composed. Mrs. Hollowell's lips pressed together, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, followed every movement. Miss Marple continued, her tone calm, almost conversational, yet with the quiet precision of a master strategist. Earlier, there was a mention of an envelope, delivered to Miss Markham, instructing her to visit the church alone. The sender intended a reaction, not an action. Such provocations reveal character and intention. And it is character and intention that ultimately expose the truth. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Miss Marple allowed the pause to deepen, giving the tension time to accumulate. "Now," she said, leaning forward slightly, "let us consider the final, most telling circumstances of the candlelight service. Mrs. Godfrey's collapse, sudden and unexpected, appeared, at first glance, to be an accident. Yet we know that accidents are rare in situations surrounded by careful observation. Mrs. Godfrey was attentive, and no one could have caused harm without intent. And yet there are those who, knowingly or unknowingly, create conditions that lead to such events." Lydia shifted in her chair, Edward's gaze sharpened, and Mrs. Hollowell's hands tightened around the arms of her chair. Miss Marple observed, her eyes unblinking, cataloguing every subtle micro-expression. "It was not Miss Markham who caused harm," Miss Marple said softly, addressing Lydia, who visibly relaxed yet remained attentive. "Nor was it Edward Langford, despite the speculations of the village. Both of you are honest in your intentions and careful in your actions. You were, however, involved indirectly, not in causing harm, but in being part of a situation that could be misinterpreted by those who observe without understanding." The room remained tense. Miss Marple shifted her gaze toward Mrs. Hollowell, whose eyes narrowed just slightly. "Beatrice Hollowell," she said gently, "you are a woman of remarkable perception. You manage the village affairs, observe the parishioners, and maintain a calm exterior. Yet it was precisely your attention to minor details, your desire to maintain propriety and control, that intersected with Eleanor Godfrey's persistent curiosity. That intersection created tension, and it was this tension that ultimately led to her demise, not by direct action, but by creating circumstances that Eleanor did not fully anticipate." Mrs. Hollowell's composure wavered almost imperceptibly. A faint tightening of the lips, a subtle shift of posture, betrayed more than words could convey. Miss Marple continued, letting the evidence unfold with quiet precision. "Consider the events of the candlelight service," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, unhurried. "The arrangements, the seating, the positioning of the choir and congregation. Mrs. Godfrey's sudden illness occurred in a place where minor physical interventions, small movements of objects, slight adjustments of chairs, could influence the outcome. The placement of a hymnal, the subtle repositioning of a candle, these are the seemingly trivial details that mattered. And the person most attentive to such details was naturally Mrs. Hollowell." A sharp intake of breath betrayed Mrs. Hollowell's awareness. Edward leaned forward slightly, observing the interaction while Lydia's eyes followed Miss Marple intently. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she concluded her gentle yet decisive explanation. "You did not intend to kill Eleanor Godfrey, Beatrice, but your actions, well-intentioned in other contexts, unintentionally created conditions that led to her death. This is a subtle but crucial distinction: intent versus consequence. Human behavior is rarely straightforward, and it is precisely the intersection of vigilance, propriety, and unanticipated reactions that led to the tragic outcome." Mrs. Hollowell's lips parted as if to protest, yet Miss Marple held up a hand. "Do not mistake my explanation for accusation. There was no malice, no premeditation, only the interplay of human nature, circumstance, and unfortunate timing. And in understanding this, we understand the truth. Eleanor's death was the result of natural causes, sudden illness, but human interactions created the precise conditions for tragedy. That is the complexity of our lives, and it is why observation is so vital." Edward exhaled quietly, a mixture of relief and contemplation passing over his features. Lydia, still tense, now allowed herself a faint smile of understanding. Even Mrs. Hollowell, though initially defensive, lowered her gaze and nodded subtly, acknowledging the subtle brilliance of Miss Marple's insight. Miss Marple added, almost conversationally, "And let us remember the hidden envelope, the anonymous summons, and the attention to minor details. All were tests, provocations, and observations that illuminated character. In small villages, actions ripple in ways that appear inconsequential but ultimately reveal motives, tendencies, and the truth of human behavior." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room, once charged with tension and speculation, now carried a quiet understanding. The mystery was resolved, not through force, accusation, or dramatic revelation, but through careful observation, patience, and the gentle application of insight into human nature. Finally, Miss Marple concluded with a faint smile. "Sometimes we need only watch, listen, and consider the subtle patterns. For it is in these patterns that truth lies, not in spectacle, nor in assumptions, but in the quiet understanding of human behavior." The villagers remained silent for a moment, absorbing the explanation, realizing that the intricate web of events had been untangled not by the obvious suspects, but by Miss Marple's understated genius. And as they left the parlor, each with their own reflections, the village of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon felt a cautious release, a mixture of relief, contemplation, and lingering awe at the quiet power of observation, patience, and wisdom. Miss Marple, alone for a moment, resumed her knitting, the faintest smile lingering on her lips. The truth, once hidden in shadows and subtle gestures, had emerged, not dramatically, not violently, but with quiet precision. And in that precision lay the enduring lesson of human nature. The snow had begun to melt slowly under the pale winter sun, leaving patches of damp grass and muddy paths along the lanes of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon. Though the air was crisp, the village felt lighter, as if the collective tension had been partially released. Eleanor Godfrey's passing, while tragic, had now been understood in context, and the villagers, though cautious, were beginning to return to their routines. Miss Marple walked along the familiar streets, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, observing the subtle shifts in behavior that marked the recovery of the community. The baker's apprentice no longer jumped at every footstep, the school children chattered with a tentative cheerfulness, and even the vicar's manner suggested a return to measured calm. Yet Miss Marple noted the village would not be entirely the same. Awareness of hidden tensions and the knowledge of what could happen when seemingly minor details intersected with human fallibility had left its mark. At Mrs. Weatherford's parlor, she reflected on the events that had unfolded. Lydia Markham had resumed her lessons with the children, her demeanor more confident, tempered by the experiences of the past week. Edward Langford returned to supervising parish matters, careful yet composed, his respect for Lydia evident in subtle gestures and attentive actions. Mrs. Hollowell, having recognized the unintended consequences of her vigilance, moved quietly among the villagers, more cautious, more reflective, but still maintaining her reputation as the pillar of propriety in St. Aldwyn. The memorial service for Eleanor had been held again, properly observed with quiet dignity, allowing the villagers to process their grief without fear or suspicion. Miss Marple attended, not as a detective seeking clues, but as a friend, a witness to the resilience of human communities. She noted how conversations were now marked by a gentler tone, a cautious openness, and a careful avoidance of speculation. People were learning, slowly, the lessons of attentiveness and restraint. Even minor details now carried significance. A misplaced chair at the village hall, a stray hymnbook on a pew, or the flicker of a candle, things that might once have gone unnoticed, were regarded with quiet awareness. Miss Marple understood that this was not fear, but an instinctive mindfulness born from the experience of recent events. Small villages, she reflected, did not easily forget lessons in human behavior. One afternoon, she invited Lydia to the parlor for tea. The young music teacher entered, composed but thoughtful, carrying herself with the poise that had been honed over the past days. "Jane," Lydia began softly, pouring tea, "I cannot thank you enough for your guidance. I see now that it was not merely observation, but understanding people that revealed the truth. I never realized how subtle human interactions could shape events so profoundly." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It is a matter of patience and attention. People often reveal more in gestures, hesitations, and fleeting expressions than in words, and in small communities such as ours, these subtleties can have consequences far beyond what anyone might expect." Lydia smiled faintly. "I shall be more mindful, not only of my own actions, but of others, and perhaps, in time, the village will be wiser for it." Outside, the villagers resumed their routines. Children laughed on the paths near the school, carrying bundles of lessons and papers. Neighbors greeted each other with cautious warmth, and tradespeople went about their business, aware that even the smallest action could ripple outward. Miss Marple observed all of this quietly, understanding that the village, though scarred by grief and tension, was resilient. Edward Langford visited the parlor the following morning, offering a simple but sincere acknowledgement. "Miss Marple," he said, "your guidance and insight have been invaluable. The village owes a great deal to your quiet wisdom." Miss Marple waved off the compliment with gentle modesty. "Edward, it is not wisdom but observation that guides understanding. People reveal their own truths when one pays attention. That is all." Meanwhile, Mrs. Hollowell, though still maintaining her usual standards of propriety, had begun to engage in conversations with more openness. She'd recognized that vigilance, while useful, could not replace empathy and understanding. Her actions, subtle and deliberate, now reflected a tempered approach, balancing care with consideration for the unintended consequences of her attentiveness. In the evenings, Miss Marple often returned to her own home, the quiet of her cottage filled with the soft ticking of clocks and the occasional rustle of pages as she read. She reflected on the events with a thoughtful satisfaction, aware that the intricate web of human interactions had been unraveled not through accusation, but through subtle observation, gentle guidance, and an understanding of the underlying patterns of behavior. Though Eleanor Godfrey's death had caused shock and uncertainty, it had also revealed the hidden dimensions of the village, the long-held secrets, the unspoken tensions, and the small gestures that could change outcomes in profound ways. And in observing these, Miss Marple recognized once more the delicate balance of human nature, the fragility of social order, and the quiet power of attentiveness. As snow continued to melt into patches of muddy grass, Miss Marple walked through the village one final time, nodding to neighbors, exchanging quiet words, and observing the subtle gestures that marked recovery. Children waved, the baker offered a cheerful nod, and even the vicar allowed a small, private smile as they crossed paths. Returning to her cottage, she settled by the fire with her knitting, a sense of calm enveloping her. The mystery had been resolved, the village had regained a semblance of normalcy, and the lessons of human behavior had been gently but indelibly impressed upon St. Aldwyn-on-Avon. And in the quiet of her home, Miss Marple reflected with gentle satisfaction. Human nature, intricate and unpredictable, always revealed its truths to those who watched closely, listened carefully, and considered each subtle sign. The village, like the lives of its inhabitants, would continue onward, tempered by experience, wiser, yet still full of the quiet mysteries that make observation both necessary and rewarding. The snow outside began to glisten in the fading light, a gentle reminder of the passage of time and of the enduring truth Miss Marple had long known. In the ordinary, one finds the extraordinary, in the small gestures, the great revelations, and in the quiet patience of observation, the answers to life's deepest questions. With her knitting completed, Miss Marple set it aside, her thoughts content yet vigilant. Life in St. Aldwyn-on-Avon would continue, as it always had, with its hidden tensions, quiet gestures, and subtle revelations. And Miss Marple, as ever, would be there, watching, observing, understanding, and quietly ensuring that the threads of truth were never entirely lost. The first clear morning after the memorial, St. Aldwyn-on-Avon seemed almost untouched by the previous week's tumult. Frost still clung to the edges of roofs and hedges, but the sunlight brought a brightness that made the village appear refreshed, almost renewed. Yet Miss Marple, as she walked along the familiar lanes, observed the subtle ripples left behind by Eleanor Godfrey's passing. Not all wounds are visible, she thought. Not all effects can be seen in laughter or polite greetings. Some are measured in glances, in hesitations, and in the careful weighing of words before they are spoken. The vicar approached her on the lane near the churchyard, a warm scarf tucked neatly around his neck. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding politely, "it seems the village is settling, though one can still sense the undercurrent of tension. I hope, perhaps naively, that time will ease it further." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Reverend, time does much, but human nature is slow to change. The echoes of events linger, often where one least expects. But observation, care, and attention can guide understanding, and sometimes even forgiveness." The vicar inclined his head, thoughtful, before moving on to tend to his parish duties. Miss Marple continued her walk, noting that each household bore its own quiet story. Mrs. Hollowell, now more tempered in her vigilance, exchanged greetings with neighbours with a gentleness that had not been present before, though her eyes retained the sharpness of awareness. Edward Langford, returning from overseeing parish work, stopped to speak briefly with Lydia, their conversation measured but cordial, shaded by a subtle understanding that had formed between them during the past week. In her own home, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting quietly, reflecting on the interplay of events that had culminated in the resolution of Eleanor Godfrey's death. The mystery, resolved in subtle precision, had provided insight not only into the incident itself, but also into the character of the villagers, their tendencies, and the hidden depths of human emotion. She recalled Lydia's reactions to the anonymous summons, the faint tremor in her hands, and the rapid glance at Edward, which betrayed a mix of curiosity and apprehension. It was a testament, Miss Marple thought, to the way human instincts can both guide and mislead, depending on the circumstances. The mind is a careful instrument, but the heart introduces its own complexities. The snow melted further as the days passed, leaving small puddles along the lanes. Villagers adjusted, returning to routines with measured care. Children played near the school, their voices carrying, but now punctuated with cautious attentiveness. Adults, while polite and composed, occasionally glanced at one another with awareness, as if each minor gesture might convey more than intended. Miss Marple's visits to the parish hall continued. She assisted quietly, offering guidance when needed, yet mostly observing. She noticed small shifts in social interactions, the way conversations were slightly slower, the way pauses were given space to unfold, and the subtle nods of acknowledgement when secrets, once hidden, were treated with understanding rather than judgment. One afternoon she called upon Lydia for tea, and the young teacher entered with a sense of calm confidence, though tempered by reflection. "Jane," Lydia said softly, placing her scarf on the chair, "I'm beginning to see how interconnected we all are. A single action, seemingly insignificant, can create consequences we might never anticipate. And yet, if we watch carefully, we can anticipate patterns and sometimes prevent misfortune before it occurs." Miss Marple smiled. Indeed, Lydia, observation is more than noticing what happens. It is understanding why. Human behavior has patterns, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, and the ability to recognize them is what allows us to act wisely. As Lydia spoke, Miss Marple noticed a change in her posture. Straightened back, relaxed shoulders, and a quiet determination in her eyes. The young teacher had grown subtly through experience and reflection, and in St. Aldwyn-on-Avon, growth was measured in quiet ripples, in tempered interactions, and in the softening of hidden tensions. Outside, the village moved with a newfound rhythm. Tradespeople conducted their work with efficiency and courtesy. Neighbors exchanged greetings that were warm but restrained, and even minor disagreements were addressed with care, as if the memory of recent events had imparted a lesson in moderation. Miss Marple, observing these shifts, reflected on the invisible threads that connected the villagers, the shared understanding that, though Eleanor Godfrey was gone, her presence in memory and consequence remained. Edward Langford visited Miss Marple in the late afternoon, a letter in hand, which he placed on her table with quiet respect. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wanted to acknowledge once more the clarity and insight you brought to the situation. The village, I believe, owes you a debt, not merely for understanding the events, but for helping us all to see ourselves more clearly." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Edward, understanding is a shared responsibility. People reveal themselves, willingly or not, and the role of observation is simply to note, consider, and reflect. Wisdom grows quietly, much like the patterns of snow melting into spring." Even Mrs. Hollowell, despite her initial defensiveness, had begun to write small notes of caution and advice to neighbors, subtle reminders about attention to detail and mindfulness rather than strict control. Her actions were evidence of reflection and learning, of recognition that vigilance alone could not prevent unintended consequences. Miss Marple spent her evenings quietly by the fire, reading or knitting, allowing herself moments of satisfaction. The village had survived, not unscathed, but resiliently. The hidden tensions, though still present, had been acknowledged and diffused, leaving room for a cautious restoration of normalcy. As the light faded across the village, casting long shadows along the lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of human behavior, its complexities and its consequences. Small actions, slight hesitations, and unspoken observations, all had combined to create the tapestry of events that led to Eleanor Godfrey's death. And in understanding them, the village had gained a subtle but invaluable wisdom. By the end of the week, the lanes of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon carried the quiet signs of recovery. Children laughing near the schoolyard, villagers greeting one another with measured warmth and the soft echo of footsteps along familiar paths. Miss Marple, walking through the village, observed each gesture with satisfaction. The story had unfolded as it always did in human communities. Subtly, unpredictably, yet ultimately revealing its truth to those who watched carefully. Returning to her cottage, she paused to glance at the snow-dappled horizon, reflecting on the quiet power of patience, observation, and understanding. Life would continue, as it always had, full of small gestures, subtle interactions, and hidden truths waiting to be noticed. And Miss Marple, as always, would be there, watching, observing, and appreciating the intricate, delicate patterns of human behavior that made every day and every mystery uniquely revealing. Winter was slowly loosening its grip on St. Aldwyn-on-Avon. The frost had retreated, leaving the village glistening in the pale sunlight of early February. Miss Marple walked along the familiar cobbled lanes, noting the subtle signs of life resuming its ordinary rhythm. Shops opened with gentle bustle, children ran lightly across the green, and neighbors exchanged greetings that were now quieter, more considerate, yet carrying an unspoken understanding of the events they had collectively endured. The village, while outwardly normal, bore traces of what had occurred during the candlelight service. The experience had revealed hidden tensions, old grievances, and human tendencies that, until recently, remained cloaked behind politeness. Yet, in the aftermath, there was also a sense of growth. People were more attentive, more reflective, and quietly aware of how actions, no matter how minor, could ripple outward. Miss Marple paused near the parish church, observing the subtle changes. The vicar was tending to the grounds, his movements deliberate and calm. A group of villagers had gathered to discuss the upcoming spring festival, their voices cheerful but tempered with care. Even Mrs. Hollowell, who now moved with a gentler air, was there, offering advice with a warmth tempered by experience. Returning home, Miss Marple found Lydia Markham arranging her lessons for the week. The young teacher's manner had shifted from tentative to quietly confident, shaped not only by the practicalities of her role, but by the lessons in human behavior she had absorbed. Miss Marple admired this transformation. It was subtle, but profound. "You see, Lydia," she said gently, "the village may appear unchanged, but each of us carries knowledge that alters our perspective. We learn from events, from observation, and from understanding human nature. That is the real legacy of this week." Lydia nodded. "I see now how minor details, gestures, even silences, can reveal as much as spoken words. I shall carry this understanding forward, not only in teaching but in observing the world around me." Miss Marple allowed a quiet smile. "Indeed, that is what will help the village, and yourself, navigate future events with greater wisdom." Edward Langford visited later in the morning, checking on parish matters and quietly observing the village's recovery. He greeted Miss Marple warmly, his expression a mixture of respect and gratitude. "Jane," he said, "the village owes you much more than it can articulate. You have guided us through subtlety, patience, and insight, and for that we are fortunate." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "Edward, understanding is a shared effort. People reveal truths through behavior, whether they intend to or not. We merely observe and interpret. The village itself has learned, in its own way, the value of attention and care. Over the following days, the parish regained its rhythm. The market operated with renewed energy, the school children laughed freely in the playground, and conversations, though polite, carried an awareness of the lessons learned. Even small interactions, such as a neighbor helping another with a fallen basket or offering a word of advice, reflected the subtle wisdom imparted by recent events. Mrs. Hollowell, having reflected on her unintended role in the candlelight service, engaged in discreet conversations with the villagers. She offered guidance with a gentleness that had previously been absent, acknowledging that attentiveness, while valuable, must be balanced with empathy and understanding. The village, in turn, began to trust her counsel, recognizing her sincerity. Lydia resumed her teaching with a newfound authority. The children responded to her attentiveness and calm demeanor, while parents observed the subtle confidence she now carried. Miss Marple noted with satisfaction how learning extended beyond classrooms and memorial services. The lessons of observation, caution, and human understanding were quietly permeating the village. Edward Langford continued to manage parish affairs with quiet competence. The interactions between villagers, once punctuated with tension and suspicion, were now marked by consideration and subtle understanding. Small gestures, once overlooked, were now observed for their potential significance. The village had grown more aware, more reflective, and in a way, wiser. Miss Marple herself settled into her daily routine, content to observe the world around her. She tended her garden, knitted by the fire, and visited neighbors when needed, always with a keen eye on subtle movements, expressions, and interactions. It was a gentle vigilance, one that allowed her to remain aware without imposing, to understand without accusing. One afternoon, as she walked through the village green, she noticed a group of children building a small snowman, their laughter carrying lightly across the square. Adults passed with polite greetings, some exchanging brief notes, others offering small gestures of help. Even in the simplest moments, Miss Marple observed, there was the evidence of growth, understanding, and quiet reflection. The vicar approached, smiling faintly. "Miss Marple, the village seems to have found a rhythm again. Perhaps this week has reminded us all of the importance of observation, care, and kindness." "Indeed, Reverend," Miss Marple replied softly. "Human nature is complex, but attentive eyes and thoughtful hearts can guide it toward understanding. And sometimes, the smallest gestures, the quietest observations, reveal truths more profound than any declaration or action." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-dappled lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the events of the past days. Eleanor Godfrey's sudden death, the subtle tensions it revealed, and the careful unraveling of motives had taught lessons that extended beyond grief or suspicion. Human behavior, with all its intricacies, had been illuminated in its quiet, understated ways. The village of St. Aldwyn-on-Avon would continue its life, tempered by experience, cautious but resilient. The villagers, now aware of the delicate balance between action, consequence, and observation, would carry forward these lessons in their interactions. And Miss Marple, ever vigilant, would remain a quiet observer, ready to note, reflect, and guide should the threads of mystery appear again. By evening, the lamps were lit along the lanes, casting a warm glow on the paths and cottages. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, settled by the fire, and picked up her knitting. Outside, the village was calm, the echoes of the past week softened into memory. The subtle ripples of human behavior had been acknowledged, understood, and absorbed, leaving behind a community that, though forever touched by recent events, was more attentive, more reflective, and quietly wiser. Miss Marple paused, looking at the flickering flames. She understood, as always, that the nature of human interaction is never simple. Yet with patience, observation, and gentle guidance, even the most intricate mysteries could be unraveled, revealing not only the truth of events, but the truths of character and the enduring patterns of human behavior. And with that quiet reflection, she resumed her knitting, content in the knowledge that St. Aldwyn-on-Avon had endured, learned, and would continue to thrive, ever mindful of the delicate, subtle forces that shape life in a small village.